Keep in touch with the Wolf Connection podcast on our Instagram handle at the Wolf Connection Pod, or email us your questions, comments, and guest ideas to podcast@wolfconnection.org. Thank you for your support, and howls to you all. Welcome to the Wolf Connection podcast. I'm your host, John Kaufman. So sometimes we don't hit on Washington State as much, I think, as Stephen and I would like, and this is a perfect individual to have on here. And I reached out. We saw some posts on Washington Wildlife First Instagram, and there was a lot of talk going on about wolves in the state. We reached out, and luckily we were able to get the founder of Washington Wildlife First. She's also the founder of Animal and Earth Advocates there in Washington State. She's coming to us from Vashon Island in Washington, which is about a 30-minute ferry ride from Seattle. She is Claire Davis. Claire, it is a pleasure to meet you finally, and wonderful to talk to you about all the things that are going on in Washington. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, John. Thanks. It's exciting to be here.
Yeah. So let's just, I know we have a lot to touch on. We were talking about this just before. Just give everyone who's listening a background about yourself, how you came to not only start and found Animal and Earth Advocates, but then right off of that, form Washington Wildlife First, and what really those two, the firm, and then also what the organization is trying to do for wildlife in the state of Washington.
Yeah, absolutely. My first career was as a journalist. And as I was working as a journalist, I became more and more involved with companion animal issues. You know, my first campaigns were really focused around animal shelters and the no-kill movement to stop killing dogs and cats in animal shelters. So I did a lot of volunteer work in that field. Then after I graduated from law school and did a clerkship, I went to work for Best Friends Animal Society, which is one of the largest animal sanctuary in the United States. I was their attorney for about 2 years. After that, ran out of money, needed to pay my law school debts off. So I came to Seattle and worked in 2 big law firms as a securities litigator. Very different from what I do now, but continue to do animal work on the side. First of all, through doing a big campaign to reform animal shelters in Seattle, the King County Animal Shelter, and then by doing pro bono work for animal legal defense funds, some other organizations, and then finally a case on behalf of Sea Shepherd Conservation Society, which was a big enough case that it allowed me to launch my own practice group at Lane Powell, my former law firm, Animal and Earth Advocacy Practice Group. And that's where I started the litigation work related to Washington wildlife, with the first case that I filed in 2019 challenging kill orders that the state issued against the Sherman wolf pack. After a couple of years working with that practice group, I fully realized that you can't really do that type of practice at a big law firm. The rates are just too high. So my partner and I founded Animal and Earth Advocates as a private law firm to do expressly wildlife, animal, and environmental public interest litigation. We do all sorts of litigation with the law firm. That's included the litigation that we brought a couple of years ago in Wisconsin, along with Greenfire Law, that successfully stopped the wolf hunt in Wisconsin until wolves were put back on the endangered species list there. It involves suits against the Forest Service over logging, and it also involves a lot of litigation against the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. That was our first lawsuit as a practice group, and I think at this point we've filed 12 different lawsuits against the State Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Yeah, I mean, so we'll hop into it because there's a lot that's obviously going on. So off of that first suit with the Sherman wolf pack and those kill orders, what for you right now seems to be the biggest issue or issues that are coming across your desk or coming into your purview on a fairly regular basis as it relates to, we'll start with wolves, but I know you cover everything else in terms of bears and fish. Fishing is a huge issue up there in Washington State as well. So what are the main focuses right now for yourself, both at Animal Earth Advocates and also Washington Wildlife First, in terms of state management and what's happening with wildlife on that end?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think it speaks to why I started Washington Wildlife First in 2021. But when I filed the first lawsuit against Department of Fish and Wildlife, I was incredibly naive. I followed wildlife issues largely on a national level, and if you'd asked me, I probably would have said, you know, our state does fine. I read the occasional article in the newspaper, mostly about wolves and orca, but probably our state does a pretty good job of managing wildlife. We're a pretty progressive state. We have a governor who's on the cutting edge of climate change. Um, and I was blown away by the level of dysfunction that first lawsuit revealed to me. So that led then not only to a number of additional lawsuits against the state, which was unexpected because when I started the practice group, I really thought that I would be doing mostly federal work. And I do some federal work, but I didn't plan to focus on Washington State until my eyes were really opened by that first suit. And then it also led in 2021 to the realization that the problems here are so deep and so systemic that I can't make meaningful change just one lawsuit at a time focused on one discrete issue with one discrete species. So that's why I worked with some other dedicated advocates to start Washington Wildlife First, which is a nonprofit 501c3 advocacy group. And our sole mission is to reform the State Department of Fish and Wildlife, not focused on just management of one species or another, but focused on addressing the real systemic, deeply rooted problems with the state's approach to managing fish and wildlife. So that's kind of I didn't, that's kind of a non-answer to your question because it's hard to pick just one species. I could rattle off a dozen species where we're actively engaged in how they're being managed and have active concerns. But our focus really is getting the crux of the problem, which is the state's approach to fish and wildlife management, not just fixing how it manages wolves or bears or salmon.
So that brings me to my question is how are you making decisions, or I should say, what is the process through which you decide what lawsuits have enough of blank to really pursue, to commit resources to spend the next years, I'm sure in some cases, working on?
Yeah, that's certainly evolved, and I've gotten pickier. And my criterion now is a lawsuit that gets at a larger issue that isn't just about, say, one kill order against one wolf pack, or something really isolated, even though that isolated issue might be very, important to a particular group that I work with, but something that gets to the crux of a larger issue, say with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. I've also filed suits against U.S. Forest Service for grazing on public lands in the Colville National Forest. I think that suit gets at some larger issues that are really the base of so many other problems. So I try to really be picky about cases that have will have a much broader impact than just solving one small discrete problem. Other cases I'm doing right now have to do with the State Department of Fish and Wildlife's chronic violation of the State Environmental Policy Act, which has to do with how they manage hatcheries and wolves and many other species, because they should be complying with with SEPA in everything that they do, and the fact that they do not has a very serious impact on how they manage everything.
Yeah, and of course, it's about winning cases and making real impacts to policies. But do you ever pursue? Does your team ever pursue something that you would say there's a small chance of us actually getting this done, but we have to make some noise about it because maybe that's a step towards change? or is it maximally important to say like we could actually win this thing?
Well, I don't take any cases that I don't think there's any prospect of winning. But I think you can say with all of my cases, especially against the state, there's a small prospect of winning. The way the law is designed, the odds are really stacked against us. I've filed now 6 actions against the state based on wolf management. Haven't won a single one. But I think that just the filing of the cases and the impact that that has on the department and knowing that someone is watching and that they will be held accountable. We've seen some tremendous changes in how they manage wolves just by the filing and the litigation of those cases. So definitely litigation can have value even if you lose.
Right.
If that were not the case, I would have been very discouraged long ago because I've won a couple of cases, but they're fewer and farther between than I would like.
Yeah. I guess that's what good lawyers do. They do it even when there's a small chance.
Right.
Well, that's a challenge, and that's a problem, and with I think it is one of the causes of the problems with state wildlife agencies nationwide is they don't get sued very often because it is very difficult to sue state agencies. You don't have the fee recovery prospects that you have with national, federal litigation, like under the Endangered Species Act and the National Environmental Policy Act. You can get great fee recovery there. With in Washington, we max out on fee recovery at $25,000 for one level of case, and that doesn't go very far in litigation, especially because state litigation tends to be very fact intensive and very work intensive. And you can see a similar pattern across the country. And government agencies do not do well when they're not being watched by someone. And one of the key components of that watchdog role, I think, has to be at least a viable threat of filing suit if they get too far out of line and are just violating the law quite plainly. And what we found in Washington and have found in some other cases where I've litigated as well is because there's no viable threat of suit or has not been historically, they can get pretty lazy and pretty complacent in doing what they want to, whether or not it complies with the law. So one of my missions, separate from what I'm doing in Washington, is to try to find a pathway to enable small advocacy organizations, state-based advocacy organizations, to bring more litigation against state agencies as part of their reform objectives.
Yeah, I mean, you had mentioned before we started, you listened to Michelle Lute's podcast there, and what they're doing with Wildlife for All is really, that's the basis of their existence, is to reform state management. They have an incredible advisory board. Dave Stalling is on that advisory board, is still a hunter, but is the anti-hunter, as he calls himself. You sent over some very interesting data that was done that was basically polling the residents of Washington. And what's surprising to me is the gulf of a difference there is when you ask people these questions about what state wildlife management is doing to these species. I think one of the ones I saw was, do you think it's appropriate for hunters to kill grizzlies or bears right out of hibernation with cubs? I didn't even know that was a thing in Washington state. And it was I was fairly certain it was overwhelmingly no, that's not great. And then it was in line a lot of with that stuff with wolves. Why do you think there is such a disconnect from, I guess, the public feeling or the public perception of how wildlife should be viewed and used, and I use that used term loosely, or experienced, than what is happening with WDFW?
So that there's a lot to unpack there in that question, John. Starting with Wildlife for All. So I'm a member of the advisory board for Wildlife for All as well, and have been involved with them for the past few years. It's interesting watching Wildlife First develop like completely independently of that on a different track. but we embrace many of the same concepts and have many of the same goals on within Washington that Wildlife for All has nationwide. Of course, Wildlife for All is trying to reform state wildlife management from a national perspective. And the only way you can really do that is state by state by state. So I think that Washington Wildlife First is doing in Washington what Wildlife for All is trying to promote nationwide. And the answer to your question about this disconnect goes to, again, the core dysfunction and core structural issues with how fish and wildlife departments, not only in Washington, but nationwide, are structured. They are purposefully isolated from politics, from the values and the needs of Washingtonians through this commission system, which it's hard to really understand how no one ever thought this would be a good system of governance. The particulars vary from state to state, but in Washington, the governor appoints, with advice and consent of the Senate, people to serve for 6-year terms on the Fish and Wildlife Commission. Once they've been confirmed by the Senate, there's nothing anybody can do to remove these commissioners, and the qualifications to be in those positions are, alarmingly low. There's no requirement of any sort of expertise. They're volunteer positions and mostly end up being taken by people who are retired, who can afford to do a heavy volunteer role like that. And the commission is the only entity that can hire or fire the director of the Department of Fish and Wildlife, the only entity that has supervision over the Department of Fish and Wildlife, and the only entity with the ability to pass rules that regulate the management of fish and wildlife in the state. That's just a bizarre system, but it explains a lot about how the department has gotten so disconnected from developments in Washington. And we're really, again, Washington is not alone. We're managing wildlife the same way we did 100 years ago. Mostly Washington is a game farm from the Department of Fish and Wildlife's viewpoint, where the department's role is to make sure there is, enough game, enough fish for anglers and hunters. It's not primarily to preserve and protect wildlife, although that is the first part of their mission statement. They manage for hunters and anglers, and that just doesn't work anymore. Not only does it ignore the enormous shift in values and demographics of the state, to the point where now only 2.2% of people in Washington hunt. It also explains why there's that huge disconnect between the values of Washingtonians and what the department does. And you mentioned one of the results from our survey, that there are a few that are really interesting. For example, only 12% of people in Washington support how the department manages coyotes, which is to allow year-round, no bag limit, no wastage requirement, very few limitations on killing coyotes. Only 12% of the population supports how we manage beaver, which is to not only allow landowners to kill beaver for property damage, but we still allow commercial trapping of beaver for their pelts. Even though the department knows full well the incredible value that beaver have as ecosystem engineers in helping us to combat the effects of climate change, helping other species to fight climate change, it's really inexplicable that we still allow trapping of beaver in Washington for fur. But the reason we have this huge disconnect is the isolation of the department from the will, the values, and the interests of the people of Washington. And that's one of the primary things that our group is trying to bridge, to eliminate that difference so the department does reflect the values and the interests of Washingtonians.
Mm.
Yeah, that's kind of astounding to me, that I'm still really stuck on the volunteer aspect of that job. I mean, when I think volunteer, I think of somebody who's a Little League coach, not somebody who's basically in charge of managing wildlife for an entire state of people that one isn't elected or put in place by the people of that state, and then can't be removed if the practices and the actions with which they're doing to the land, to the wildlife there, doesn't serve the community. So that to me is far, I just don't understand that, especially from, like you said, Washington is a progressive state. I believe the from the top down, I think they believe, or they say at least, the right things. I think to the general public, from what I understand, like, oh no, we're managing this for you in the way that we think is best suited for Washingtonians. Um, I don't know. That still just has me sort of flabbergasted that that is something that would be done. Um, what are the major issues that you see? Because I know there's some stuff coming up for wolves. I want to say September 8th. What are some of the major issues that you're tracking for wolves specifically? Because I know we've talked with some individuals in Washington State, a range rider, specifically Daniel Curry, who's really trying by his lonesome really to shift the change of cattle ranching perspective to wolves and how to manage that with humans who are range riding across the state and helping them with that problem. But where do you see the major issue or the dividing line for those with wolves? Because from what I understand, the majority are on the eastern side of the state, which is where a lot of that forest area is. They're not obviously on the western part with Seattle and the bigger cities. So where is a lot of those issues coming up, and what are the major things that you're tackling or you're seeing at Washington Wildlife First for wolves specifically for now?
I think to understand how Washington Wildlife First operates, we really have two different tracks of approaching reform. And the first is a longer term goal of reforming the structure and the mandate of the department and the governance structure of the department. And we made some big strides, not in the legislature earlier this year, because we obtained approval for $300,000 in funding for a study that is now underway to examine where there are gaps in the department filling its role as a public trustee of our fish and wildlife, gaps in its ability to meet the threats of climate change and biodiversity loss, several other items. So that's going on one track where we're looking long range at fixing what you rightly observed is just a crazy system of governance so that we can fix these issues going forward and not have the department stray so far from the public. But on the flip side, at least I'm way too impatient to wait for that to happen before we actually see things change. So we've also been very involved in the commission appointment process and in working with the Fish and Wildlife Commission to bring about better policies. Now, we've seen a tremendous change in the constitution of the commission as a result, so that we now have, by and large, extremely well qualified people on the commission who understand science and law, the complexity of all the challenges facing fish and wildlife. For example, we have the former director of the U.S. Marine Mammal Commission is on our Fish and Wildlife Commission now, and it's just crazy to have someone at that level of expertise. As a result of this changing composition of the commission, we have some opportunities to make some differences now. And you mentioned September 8th, and that's going to be an important opportunity coming up with wolves specifically. Watching Wildlife First with 10 other organizations that are part of our broader coalition in Washington has introduced a rule through a rulemaking petition that would regulate how the state makes decisions about whether or not to kill wolves through state management actions. That will come up to the commission for a vote on September 8th. It follows on a similar rule that Center for Biological Diversity, which is one of the petitioners now, brought a couple of years ago. But we have there's at least a very good chance of it actually passing this time, and of the commission forcing the department to undergo rulemaking. And if they did, and if they adopted a rule really anything close to what we've proposed, it would legitimately make Washington like a national leader in managing wolves in accordance with science rather than, fear and myth and, you know, making rational decisions about when it makes sense to kill wolves in response to livestock conflicts.
Mm.
So that's the biggest thing on our radar
What are
screen
the
right now is hoping that our rule will go through.
right? What just describe some of the what are the changes that you're hoping specifically for that in terms of management? I know you say science based, but what are the main drivers? Are we talking about um, correct identification of, say, depredation? Are we talking about what are the things that you're looking specifically for to change in that ruling for wolves? And just as we're on this topic.
Yeah, so our rule would solve a number of problems that we've seen in Washington because Washington does not currently have a binding rule that instructs the department about when it can kill wolves for livestock predations. They have a protocol that's been developed through a collaborative process through the Wolf Advisory Group that they really feel free to follow or not follow at will with a very little transparency or accountability for how they're going about these decisions. What our rule would do is put an emphasis on non-lethal deterrence and responsible livestock management first and foremost, and set into rule a requirement that the department will have verified the existence and use of at least two appropriate non-lethal deterrents that have been in place for 14 days before any qualifying predations that they're going to count toward killing wolves. It also sets a minimum of 3 confirmed predations within 30 days before the department can consider killing wolves. And one of the most important features is that none of the predations that it counts toward that total can be on public land. 80%, I'm sorry, 90% of the wolves that Washington has killed to date have been as a result either entirely or at least in large part of predations that occurred on public lands, largely in the Colville National Forest in the northeast area of the state. So if you take that out of the total, it changes things dramatically in Washington. And if you're familiar with the Colville at all, it is densely forested, rugged land. You look at it, you walk through it, you don't think, hey, this is a great cattle pasture. You think this is wolf country, and it is wolf country. And there are predations on cattle there because it's all sectioned off into livestock grazing allotments where the tradition has been that people turn their livestock out at the beginning of the season in the spring and hope they come back in the fall, and there is no supervision of them in the meantime. So of course, not only wolves, but cougar and bear, they're going to eat livestock with that practice. That practice only worked when we'd wiped out all the predators from the forest. When we have any sort of healthy ecosystem balance, of course, it doesn't work anymore. And the state doesn't control that. The federal government controls the fact that we continue to allow grazing in the Colville National Forest. But the state does control whether or not we're going to continue shooting wolves and also cougar or other predators for preying on the livestock that are put out there with no supervision and no protection. So our rule would stop that insanity. It would also require that if the department concludes that all of these thresholds have been met, that it can issue a kill order against really the problem wolf, the wolf that it believes is responsible for the predations, not shooting members of a pack, sometimes members of the wrong pack at random, not killing pups who are too young to even hunt, which they've done routinely, not exterminating whole packs, which they've done in the same areas that Colville National Forest year after year after year. But if they are going to use lethal removal, making it a targeted lethal removal of a single wolf at a time, they believe is responsible for the predations. But it really, most lethal removal would disappear under our rule because of the other requirements, the requirement that non-lethal deterrents be used first, and the requirement that predations be on private property and not public forests.
Wow, that's wild that they can they can remove wolves from public land. Wow. So
It gets crazier, even so. And
so when cows are I mean, I live in this place where a lot of cows graze in the mountains. They can be in incredibly remote places. What process would really accurately pinpoint an exact animal that may have killed a cow months ago? I mean, what's the process by which they determine the which wolf is responsible? I mean,
well, that's a question, and that's really the challenge that we want to put on the department. They do have a lot of wolf packs radio colored, so they can tell,
ah,
wolves are, and they can tell their proximity to where there were predations.
I
So
see.
that's one
I see.
possible way. But it goes more at the core of uh, the nonsensical process that they use now, which is, they determine that a wolf pack is responsible for predations. And then days, often weeks later, they go up in helicopters and sharpshooters will shoot at random members of that wolf pack, often killing pups who, can't even hunt yet. They're certainly not responsible for predations. And the reasoning for this continues to astound me. I've heard, the reasoning is in part to reduce the nutritional needs of the pack, which is just a fancy and longer way of saying if we kill all the wolves, then wolves won't eat cattle anymore. But the other rationale is that the pack will somehow learn a lesson from this, that it will connect a meal that it had 2 weeks earlier to one or more of its members being shot from a helicopter at random, often many, many miles from where the predation took place. And anyone who has a dog knows that that's crazy. It's like, you want to punish your dog for, peeing in the house by randomly, hitting another dog in your household 2 weeks later. Is your dog really going to get a message from that?
You've got
Of
2 seconds.
not.
You have two
And
seconds.
there's the same insanity of how Washington and many other states handle wolf predations.
Mhm.
If they can target a wolf that, for example, they can show has become habituated to preying on livestock, and if it were me, I would say there should be no lethal management of wolves. We shouldn't be killing wolves at all, but we're trying to be reasonable here and reach a compromise and saying, okay, if you can target a wolf who has become habituated to eating livestock, and that wolf is a problem, and all of these other thresholds have been met, then, okay, this rule would still allow you to use lethal control. But the truth is that they probably can't. And if they can't, they should not be killing wolves at random because it makes no sense. And of course, it's not effective at solving livestock conflicts. And there's a lot of science that shows this, but I can't think of a better case study than Washington State, where we have eliminated packs in the same area of Colville, the same grazing allotments, year after year after year, often eliminating the entire pack. Then an entirely new pack moves in the next year, and we have conflicts again. What's the commonality there? It's not the wolves. They aren't bad wolves. It's the livestock producers who aren't protecting their cattle, who are grazing cattle often knowingly right on top of wolf den sites and rendezvous points, and leaving carcasses out that draw wolves to their cattle, not having effective range riders that are supervising their cattle. If you don't solve that problem, you're going to continue to have conflicts, because again, Colville is a wonderful area for wolves to live. They're going to continue to see that as a wonderful area for wolves to live, and new packs will keep moving in and keep having this same conflict year after year.
Are the folks that are executing these types of depredation issues with removing certain animals, do they have to be consulted by biologists or scientists, or is there science being taken into consideration? Because I mean, obviously, we talk to a lot of biologists, and I think indiscriminately killing wolves is generally not a real solution to any issue, really.
Well, yeah, indiscriminately killing wolves is a solution, I guess, if you kill all the wolves, and that's what we were not so many years ago. So that stops livestock predations. Hopefully, we're not going down that path again. And short of that, it's no solution at all. What you ask about it is going back to the earlier point. We have seen a big improvement in this process as a result of the first lawsuit that we filed related to the Sherman Pack in 2017. At that point in time, there was no documentation whatsoever about how this decision was made. When we filed suit and we said, show us the decision, show us, how you made this decision. They had nothing. It was a phone call, and it was a decision by the director to kill wolves. As a result of litigation, they now go through a much more intensive process that starts with a recommendation from their district team, which is composed of conflict specialists and biologists and managers, that then goes to the regional manager, that then goes to the director. And they have to, substantiate that they know this pack was responsible for predations. They pretend to follow the current protocol, which does require non-lethal measures to be in place for a reasonable amount of time before the predations. And there have to be currently, according to the protocol, 3 predations within 30 days or 4 within 10 months. There are lots of problems with that protocol. Mainly it's voluntary, and it's not a rule that they have to adhere to. So what we found in litigation is that they check these boxes saying that many of these things have happened, when in fact we find out later that they have not in fact happened. But even just putting that protocol into rule form would make a huge difference, because it's at least a process, and we've seen a huge improvement in the process since 2017 as a result of litigation. I think a lot of wolves have been saved as a result, but we need to take the next step towards accountability and injection of some transparency, accountability, and sense into the policy of when the department kills wolves. And that's what our rule would do. You know, you want it to look into the insanity of what Washington does. It gets even worse when you consider 90% of the wolves that we've killed have been killed at least in part because of predations on public lands. 80% of the wolves that taxpayers have paid Department of Fish and Wildlife to kill have been killed at least in part due to predations of cattle belonging to a single livestock owning family. And that includes wolves that have been entire packs that have been exterminated year after year after year in the same grazing allotments in the Colville National Forest. The same rancher has been involved in that. And that's particularly crazy. Our rule would prevent that from continuing to happen, because the voluntary protocol is not preventing that from continuing to happen, and the department will not even consider the commonality of the same producer over and over again causing these conflicts.
I was going to say the insanity of not understanding that what's the common denominator in this situation. And I think I read about this. I want to multiple times about this cattle rancher and they're being responsible for a lot of these wolves being shot with taxpayer dollars. What are the tools that you guys are using to educate or inform the public, I would say? Because again, I keep going back to what you gave us, and I'll read these really quick. So, and it's outright support of killing endangered wolves for preying on cattle is 25%. Supporting or opposing killing state endangered wolves for preying on cattle who have not taken reasonable steps is 22%. Like a lot of this stuff, there's a majority of the people in the state that disagree with these practices. What is the information that's not making its way to either, I guess, the cattle ranching family or the ones that support this? What are the myths that are still, I guess, simmering with these individuals or these groups that are not understanding that, as you mentioned, if you remove one or two or an entire pack of animals from a place, one will just shift in. If you lose the parents of these packs, particularly the mother, the father, the male lead and female, the young pups do not understand, okay, well, this is food that's just sitting here. We're going to eat this food, and we're not going to learn how to hunt and get away from this stuff. So what are you and Washington Wildlife First doing informationally, I guess, to reach out to people and say, hey, look, this is the research or this is the studies, or how are you guys going about it? Because I know sometimes when you talk at people, it doesn't necessarily work. So is there a way that you guys do that differently in terms of informing the public?
Yeah, I think that the biologists for the Department of Fish and Wildlife understand all of these things very well. We have some excellent biologists who work for the State Department. And when I'm critical of the department, I'm not being critical of its employees. I'm being critical of its management, which has a terrible track record of ignoring, distorting, or burying science that does not align with the action that it wishes to take. Because of the crazy governance system that we have, there is no connection between what the people think and what the people want and what the department does. Instead, we've seen a department that is controlled by special interests, including the cattle ranching industry, which in Washington is really minuscule, has an enormous degree of influence in terms of how these policies are developed. You mentioned our poll, and we asked a number of questions. Overall support for killing, wolves for preying on cattle, only 38%. On killing wolves for preying on cattle in public forest land, 25%. Killing wolves when cattle have not been protected by the ranchers adequately, 22%. And then go down to killing wolves when cattle were being knowingly grazed on top of wolf den sites, gets down to 19%. Those scenarios that we talked about there would cover almost all the wolves that have been killed in Washington, but the department doesn't have any obligation to think about what the people want because it isn't accountable to the people. So that's something long term that we want to change, and that is important to change so that we have better decisions on management issues for wolves and many other species. But in the short term, it's about educating the people who sit on the Fish and Wildlife Commission, because they're going to make the decision about whether or not to pass a rule that would constrain what department management does. And it's about putting these facts in front of them and really convincing them of the insanity of the current system, if you want to call it a system charitably, and the need to do something different that makes more sense, that is more in line with the values of the people of Washington. So they are really our audience. I don't think that this is a huge problem in Washington. The department frequently says, and I agree with them, that many ranchers, many livestock owners are taking steps to protect their cattle. Many livestock owners are behaving sensibly. Only a tiny number of wolf packs in the state have conflict with cattle, and only a tiny number of livestock producers have conflict with wolves. The problem really is in the outliers who are not accidentally failing to protect their cattle. They know exactly what they're doing, and they will continue the same practices as long as they are enabled and subsidized and continuing the same practices. What we control is how the state government reacts to those outliers and whether or not we continue to kill wolves for them, because I don't think it's a widespread problem. I think that livestock owners, for the most part, really are trying to protect their cattle. They're trying to adjust to the existence of predators on a landscape, and they're behaving sensibly as a result. We just need to stop the department from taking such extreme action in response to a few outliers who are not taking responsible steps.
This is making me wonder a thought I've never had before, and maybe you've explored this, but does some of the disproportionate favoritism that we're talking about on the topic of interest groups like ranchers, for example, that get the largest voice, does this have anything to do with land ownership and paying for that land, of course, meaning, and I'm presuming very hard here for the sake of the question and exploring this thought, but you do have a majority of populations these days living in cities, right? In most states. but these folks are not owning much land. They're not owning much property. I'm sure a lot more people are renting in major cities than own. And of course, I'm presuming for the sake of this thought. And then you have most of the rest of the state, at least, that doesn't consist of wild lands and public lands being privately owned by individuals who I'm sure also have a higher rate of disapproval for wolves, but they own a lot of land and they're paying for a lot of land. Do you think that plays a part in the issue with with small populations having more seats at the table? I guess is the only way I can think to say it.
I've not really thought that through entirely. My instinct is to say I don't think so. Washington doesn't have an income tax. It funds the government through property tax. So there's a link there. And the taxpayers as a whole fund most of the operations of the Department of Fish and Wildlife. Only about 8% of its revenues comes from hunters, either directly through state licenses or through federal funding, like through Pittman-Robertson. But if you look at how property taxes are calculated, someone who owns a house in an urban area of Seattle, that property is going to be worth a lot more than some rural acres in the eastern part of the state. There's, I think, not an entirely rational explanation for the degree of influence they have, except that the department it is accustomed to viewing hunters, anglers, and commercial entities as its customers and serving those entities and serving the interests of those entities and not taking its public trust responsibilities to the rest of the state seriously. One of our big hurdles is educating and involving the rest of Washington in what the department does, because they haven't been asked for their opinion for the last many decades. The people who ask for their opinion when they set hunting seasons, for example, are hunters, not non-hunters, even though that's 98% of the population. They don't know non-consumptive users, we want to use that term, they don't know what the department does, what kind of decisions it's make. They haven't been involved in that circle for so long. So you have the most informed voices by and large, and the loudest voices being those longstanding customers who have been involved historically and who continue to be consulted first and foremost. So that huge shift between who does the department serve? Does it serve 2.2% of the population that hunts exclusively? Does it serve the minuscule part of the state that's involved in livestock production, or the much larger industry, the commercial timber industry, or does it serve the interests of all of us? That's the fundamental shift that has to take place, because they've been entirely captured by the small special interests that have been running state fish and wildlife policy for so long.
Mm-hmm. I want to also mention something that you sent to it that might speak to the shift that might already be maybe it's there and it's like on the cusp, because there was another thing you sent here, that there was a proposal that the department actually wanted to downlist wolves from endangered to sensitive, which again I can't see how that's justified. I know you said in the notes that you sent that it looks like that's been stopped from moving forward. It's not withdrawn, but it's not scheduled for a vote. Do you think there's at least some rational thinking? Obviously, it had to be, if it was stopped, there has to be some sort of rational thinking in that, in wherever this was proposed, to be like, I don't think we're there yet. I mean, I think if you look over the contiguous United States, I think it's fair for most of us to say that wolves have not, have they come back to a decent sized population? Yes. I think overall, if you're going to tell me that Washington, do you know the amount of the population of wolves in Washington isn't a couple hundred or something like that?
The last annual report counted 216.
216. So, I mean, I think, at least from my perspective, looking at that, for somebody to say to downlist them from endangered to sensitive in a state where they only have 260 wolves, where I'm sure they could probably hold minimum at least double that amount, just seems, that it's. Stephen asked this a lot too, and I was just thinking this now that I'm going through this rationale. are these departments? I guess we'll stick, obviously Washington in particular. Are they trying to push the pendulum so far to the other side and being like, let's, we have 260 wolves, so why don't we just push it and be like, no, they're okay, so we're just gonna we're gonna downgrade them to sensitive. We're gonna hunt them sort of at will. It is are they basically showing their hand to a degree of placating to, like you say, the 2% or whatever they are, the ones that are in power, to say, well, we can kind of do whatever we want and no one's really going to fight us on it. And are they okay to do that? You understand kind of what I'm getting at? That it's just, why would we go so far to the other side instead of looking for compromise? You know what I mean?
I think that they know now that they're going to be fought on proposals like this, because we have a good track record over the past few years of opposing proposals like this. And Washington Wildlife First has put together a coalition of now 65 um, local, state, and national organizations that work within Washington that are dedicated to the idea, or that joining us in the idea that the department needs to be reformed, and that what we communicate with and have a convention for each year, and often have joint campaigns and sign-on letters. So we've assembled really a powerful force to oppose proposals like this. The proposal to downlist makes very little sense, especially if you look at the 2011 Wolf Management Plan, which set into place standards for downlisting wolves and then eventually removing them from the state endangered species list. And most important of those standards was that there be recovery and a number of breeding pairs and packs in each of the 3 recovery zones of the state. As of the last annual report, there was only what they called a novel presence of wolves, been there for 1 year in one of those recovery zones, which is also the largest recovery zone with the most wolf habitat in the state. So they don't even come close to fulfilling the recovery objectives of their own management plan. They're just disregarding those with their wolf downlisting proposal. They also don't fit their own rules, which require to be downlisted that a species is no longer facing a threat of extinction in a significant part of the state. Well, they don't exist for all intents and purposes in the largest recovery zone in the state. So they are functionally extinct in a significant portion of the state. So the proposal made very little sense. With the help of coalition members, Washington Wildlife First was able to get citizens involved and create a lot of outrage over this proposal. Governor Inslee wrote a letter opposing the downlisting proposal, and as you mentioned, it's now been taken off the calendar for a decision date. It's still out there, but they are no longer pushing for a decision in October as they were previously. So we certainly hope that the proposal is dead. But if you look at their motivations for making the proposal to start with, I think it goes back to, as you said, trying to placate these interest groups. And my guess is that their rationale is that just by making the proposal, they placate those interest groups. Even if the proposal doesn't pass, then they can blame that on those anti-hunter animal rights activists on the commission. All of that's nonsense, of course, but department management can point the finger there. Or if it did pass and we were to challenge it in court, which is a near certainty that we would, if the court invalidated the downlisting proposal, then they can point the finger at activist judges who are interfering with department management. I think for them, I suspect that it was important for them to make the proposal to satisfy the constituency of people in this remote northeast corner of the state who have been demanding for a long time that wolves be taken off the endangered species list, because they complain that they have too many wolves in that part of the state, and it's not fair to them that they continue to be managed as a state endangered species.
So let's say we've been talking a lot about this in the last few episodes. So let's say we are able to reform our management methods, and it becomes common practice to include the sentiments of other interest groups other than hunters and ranchers. I mean, this is definitely for a lack of better words, but do all relevant interest groups have equal power, equal say? Should they have proportionate power to their population numbers, to their economic influence, to their effect to wild places, to their proximity to wild places? Like, how do we define a level of appropriate influence, and who should most influence wildlife policy? Or is it simply just about having everyone speaking on these decisions and then favoring the majority opinions? Or how do we work this out? Because there are a lot of folks with a lot of different life experiences and locales and all sorts of things. Um, but yeah, this topic gets me thinking about these kinds of questions.
Yeah, and our Fish and Wildlife Commission has been focused on these questions a lot lately as well. Whose voice should we be listening to? Because it's a difficult puzzle for them. Um, as volunteers who are appointed by the governor without any mandate from the people. And I think the answer to that question is we default to democracy. Paraphrasing, Winston Churchill, it's the worst form of governance in the world except for every other one. It's certainly not perfect. It's messy. It's ugly, and it frequently comes to conclusions that I don't agree with. But it's the best we've got. And if you were to reform the system, and that's why systemic change is so important, to connect the department again to democracy, to have commissioners through some, if we even have a commission anymore, to have them have some accountability to the people through the governor or through a directly elected government official, then the problem kind of works itself out, because then the commissioners who are making the decisions, or the other people who are making those decisions, maybe it's just the governor because it becomes a cabinet position. They have a mandate to govern in the way that they said they would when we elected them. And that solves a lot of those problems for us, because right now the commissioners say, quite reasonably, who am I to impose my values and my sense of ethics on these decisions? And that's a fair question, because no one elected them. No one said, we want you to impose your ethics and your sense of values. We need to return to the fundamental system that this country is developed for determining whose values count and which interests count. And that's a democratic system. What we have now is really anti-democratic. And that's why it allows the minority voice of those powerful interest groups to outweigh the voice of most Washingtonians.
So you mean a system where the representatives are actually being representative of their populations, or do you mean a system or do you mean a democratic system to the point where we do more of kind of what we did in Colorado, which is have the public actually vote on things of this nature?
I think that I'm a big fan of the public initiative process, but it's very expensive and time consuming and can only be used sparingly. So it's not going to solve all the problems we have with wildlife management. I think we have to make the department directly accountable. I don't know if I'm skeptical that there is a way for a commission to continue to exist in a way that makes any sense, at least being in anything other than an advisory capacity. The most direct way to do this would be have, the governor responsible for the Department of Fish and Wildlife. So if we don't like something that's happening there, we complain to the governor, and he cares about that because he is elected. In the past, we complained to the governor, and he says very correctly, can't do anything about it. I have no direct control over anything that they do. I can't tell them to stop killing wolves for one rancher in the eastern part of the state. I can't tell them to do anything. So that's why we see it, the governor writing letters asking for things as a supplicant rather than making policy. That would be the most direct way, so that people then have an elected official they can complain to when decisions are not being made in accordance with their values. And we don't have that now.
That's wild to me there's nobody there to go to. Do you, Clara, think if Washington keeps going down this path, because clearly Washington Wildlife First is continuing to bring these issues up and calling out the department, and the wolves that are in the northeastern part of that state, I believe, are considered part of the Northern Rockies. That's why they aren't. I think they're not federally protected. Do you believe, or do you feel, what in your opinion, your professional opinion, if the department keeps going down this road, they will be part of that system where the federal government might have to take over? Because it's not. I know we've been, obviously we talk about wolves a lot, but it's not just wolves. We're talking about bears. We're talking about salmon. Do you think it's something that down the road, if it gets even worse than it is now, that power could return to the federal government in terms of managing Washington's wildlife?
So in Washington, in the western 2/3 of the state, wolves are listed under the ESA, and they are not, as you said, in the eastern third of the state, because that's part of the Rocky Mountain population that was, delisted by the congressional rider. So that population might be relisted because of the mess that Idaho and Montana and Wyoming are making with their wolf management. But I look at the issue much more broadly and really encourage anyone who cares about wolves or other species to become involved in management on a state level. Because even if wolves are returned to the endangered species list, that's going to be temporary. That the system does not work, that the federal government controls our wildlife. States control our wildlife. If a species is listed on the endangered species list, that the goal, at least in theory, is that they're going to come off that list at some point, as wolves have done, on and off again, and then control will revert to the states. So we have to fix state wildlife governance if we care about wolves, if we care about grizzly bears, if we care about larger issues of biodiversity and other species, because the state is ultimately going to have control sooner or later, and we need to fix what is wrong with our state wildlife agencies so that it is not a catastrophe when control is returned to the states, as it's been in Idaho, my home state, for example. Until we do that, we're just going to be, playing this ping pong game where species like wolves are on, listed and then delisted and then relisted again. The federal government and the endangered species list cannot continue to be our substitute for responsible state wildlife management, and it is not for most species. I think we have to fix things at the state level.
Do you believe that there is a positive outlook for state wildlife management in the state of Washington?
Absolutely. And we've made, point to just the extraordinary progress we've made in less than 2 years. We are fortunate in Washington that we have this enormous disconnect between what the people of Washington believe and want and what the department is doing. And it stands to reason, and it's proven in fact, that we can close that disconnect eventually. It might take a whole lot longer than I would like, but we can close that eventually. In other states, my home state of Idaho, where you don't have the same sort of disconnect, it's going to be a lot more challenging. But in Washington, we can fix this, and we are fixing this. It's just going to be a long, difficult battle to get there. And the battle is made all the more difficult because we're getting interference by powerful national groups who see that we're making progress in Washington and see that as a threat. So they're using extremely inflammatory rhetoric and outright lies, calling Washington, for example, ground zero in the anti-wildlife, anti-conservation movement. So we're seeing these outside groups from outside the state become involved more and more, because we are making progress in Washington. One sign of that progress was last year when the department, or the commission, finally outlawed recreational spring bear hunting, which is what you one of the poll results you referred to earlier. Only 8% of the Washington population supports recreational killing of bears in the spring because it orphans cubs, because it targets the population when it's at its most vulnerable, recovering from winter. That's a small step, because the spring bear hunt is a small hunt, but it is a step, and it's the first time in recent memory that the commission has stood up and said, we're not going to do what the department is telling us to do. We're not going to cave at the special interest groups that are screaming at us that they should have the right to kill bears in the springtime. We're going to look at the facts and the science and the ethics of this policy and make a change. I think that we are making a lot of progress in Washington, and I hope that we pick up the pace over the next few years to making some big changes in wildlife management, which I feel obligated to say because it's one of the myths that's perpetuated out there. It does not mean the end of hunting in Washington. We don't support the end of hunting in Washington. That is the scare tactic that national groups like Howl for Wildlife and the Sportsman Alliance are using to get people involved in Washington. It means responsible wildlife management based on ecosystem health, based on honest reporting of what the science says, and based on what is important to the people of Washington.
Absolutely. I'm really I'm glad that you said that, and I think it's something that Stephen and I really try to drive home, is that we want to be a balanced voice. We want things to be balanced, and so that everyone has a voice, a seat at the table, because otherwise, again, we are just in these factions back and forth and nothing gets done, and we just continue to be polarized, and that's just not the way anything's going to move forward. It's not the way it's going to work. Claire, just tell everybody where they, and I love your call to action for people to get involved. If people want to get involved who are listening to this, go for Washington. Where can they get involved? What can they look at? Get them to Washington Wildlife First, but give them some places to go so they can help you with this mission if it calls to them.
Yeah, the most direct way would be to go to our website, which is WA Wildlife First, which is WA wildlifefirst.org, and sign up for updates and to support us because we try very hard to keep our membership apprised of the big issues as they come down the pike. We're also on Facebook at the same address, and they can follow us there. So that would be where I would point them.
My final question for you, Claire, is when you hear the word wolf, what is the thing that comes to your mind?
I equate wolves with what is left in the country that is wild. And I think that's why they're such a good symbol for the battle that we are waging in Washington and elsewhere to preserve some parts of the country for the wild. And I think wolves are a great illustration of that.
Claire Davis, thank you for just a wonderfully educational, informative discussion. You're doing it to the nth degree. Thank you so much for all of your efforts, for founding the Animal and Earth Advocates, Washington Wildlife First, and just continuing to push the positivity and reform forward. So thank you so much for all that you do.
Thank you. I really appreciate this opportunity. I enjoyed talking to you today.
Yeah, absolutely. Just stick around for just a minute while we sign off. How's to you all out there, and Stephen, I'll be with you next time. Bye, everybody. Looking for more information about Wolf Connection or the podcast? Please visit our website at wolfconnection.org, where you can donate, sponsor a wolf, or become a volunteer.